This week, in my appreciation call out to the National Park Service, I wanted to spend a little time reinforcing just how vast and unique an institution this is. The United States and its territories are divided up into 12 regions. From Region 1, which encompasses the original North and Mid-Atlantic colonies, plus Kentucky, and Region 2, which is basically the southern colonies plus Florida, all the way over to Region 11, Alaska, and Region 12, which is Hawaii and other Pacific territories. 3 through 10 cover all manner of wild and historical sites in between, with approximately 450 separate parks and sites overseen by the service. This is a resource unlike anything anywhere else. Now, I had been a desultory user and appreciator of the National Park Service until I started digging in, and guess what I found? They offer itineraries of heritage travel, ways to visit some of the 3,000 sites that they have cataloged, which include both federally managed sites and important locally curated historical places. Some of the 60 suggested itineraries include travel where women made history in invention, emigration, and economic development. There's the Amistad trip in Connecticut, the Camino Real that traces the road of New Spain through Alta California, and a trip around Detroit that traces music history there, especially interesting as that city finds its new way. There's the mainstreamiest of mainstream culture along Old Route 66 and another tour that takes you through the historic water projects in the American Southwest, especially interesting now that we are in a prolonged drought, and which in our timeline are just getting started as water becomes an essential resource with the building of America's railroads. So check out these surprising trails of history the National Park Service has assembled for us, right here in our midst. They're holding our history right there for us to see. Episode 141, The Forking of America, where we start to stop eating with our hands. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the spread of the fork in America. It started out as a plaything of the wealthy, but in the first half of the 19th century, it will start to spread out among the regular folks. The change in flatware will also start to alter how we eat with each other. To find out this and answers to other fork questions, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that in these early days of America, most people ate with their hands and a spoon. And that's it. When they say the past is a foreign country, this is the kind of stuff they're often talking about. These small actions and unthinking habits that make up our days, but would be completely interrupted were we to travel into the past, or as I get older, even to our childhoods. For me, it would just start with having to once again remember phone numbers, carry change, and get directions to the place I was going before I left the house. Now, I had never really thought about the how people ate in the 18th and 19th century of America when I started this. I was really focused on the what. But archaeology is something that reaches further into daily life than we normally think about. We consider archaeology now and how it's an established science. So, like other sciences, it also keeps expanding as we learn about new things and get new equipment. Controlled excavations, rather than just digging up cool stuff, has only been with us since the middle of the 19th century. Though there are records of Egyptian historians in the 3rd century BCE who studied much earlier periods of Egyptian civilization, so like 2,000 years before that, but that gets pretty inception-y and makes my brain ache. But here in our modern times, the material archaeology of what people were eating keeps bumping up against my research. Bones and shells in piles to confirm or refute purported diets, broken pottery, stoneware or porcelain to give a fuller picture of who was rich or not, and utensils, so I find out who was brushing their teeth and what kind of knives they had, and did they have forks. Anyway, literally excavating records of earlier archaeological excavations is something I have run across in my short detour into the history of forks in America. We've always been interested in our own story. And some people get real mad when they find out what the story was and then try to bury it all over again. As a result, how people ate turns out to be just as interesting as what they ate. In fact, in many cases, the how molds the what. When you stop eating with just your hands and a spoon, how food is prepared, what food is desirable or fashionable, and how it is served all changes with the instruments. Now, if you're the type who has read books from the 19th century, especially the ones that have a bit of comedy of manners, there's always this gag where someone scandalously uses the tablecloth to wipe their hands. Now, when I was first reading those books, it confused me. Who would do that and why? Especially when they're those napkins or serviettes for those of you who are not speaking American English. But also, how were people's hands getting so messy? Turns out because they were eating with their hands, or at least partially. Just as there is persnickety etiquette now about how to hold forks and in which hand and such, there were plenty of rules about the polite way to consume your food with your hands or with your knife in your hands. Later on, the tablecloth bit would be replaced in the 20th century with the rube from the country drinking from the finger bowl. Finger bowls. Let me pause here. In case most of your life has been spent in the 21st century, I think I need to explain. China sets used to contain these small bowls that looked a bit like a small handleless Asian teacup. They were filled with warm water and sometimes some lemon slices, and they were to be used to dip one's fingers in after eating finger-appropriate foods. By the time we get to the 20th century, when forks were firmly established everywhere, these finger foods had basically been reduced to things like asparagus, artichokes, olives, and raw fruit. By the second half of the 20th century, when pretty much no one could remember a time without forks, finger bowls had been reduced almost completely to ludicrous affectations, since almost no one was eating anything with their fingers. Oh, how quickly that would change. But back where we are, in the early 1800s, finger bowls made sense because fingers were widely used, even at the fanciest of tables. You needed a way to rinse off the meat sauces in polite company because sucking your fingers simply would not do. So just how common was eating with the hands in America before the spread of forks? Well, if we look back at those earliest colonizers on America's shores, the Jamestown colony and the Pilgrims, archaeology and written journals tell us quite a bit. Based on the extensive archaeology of the area, there were no dining forks, only sharp knives and spoons in early Jamestown, and if you think about it for a moment, it really makes sense. This was a military encampment of only men. Remember how they were pining for their bread and beer? At the beginning, when they were full of swagger and confidence, or at the end starving and eating their horses, at no time were they on the cutting edge of polite dining practices. Now, a bit later and a bit further north at the successor to Plymouth Colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, that's the location of the first recorded instance of a dining fork in not yet America. In 1633, there was an event when one John Winthrop, the governor of said colony, took out his personal fork, known then as a split spoon, at the dining table. Scandalized, a visiting clergy member railed against this evil implement. Governor Winthrop was forcibly informed that the only thing worthy of God's food were the fingers of the diner, which were also made by God. This is also at the same time when plates were in short supply in the English colonies, so it was common to find tables constructed with little wells or depressions in them. The meal would be served on communal platters, and the victuals would be scooped by hand or spoon into these spots, and each diner would use their hands to eat, just as they had back in Europe where they had come from. It is important to note that scooping out or being served one's own portion was the way, rather than eating the meal from a common plate. This habit sets England and much of Europe apart from societies that had and continue to have communal eating habits. You can see it today in food presentation. There are societies where food is presented with the expectation that everyone will share from a common plate, and all people continue to take from the common plate from the entire meal. And others where division is expected. Either everyone moves their food from the common plate onto their own, or everyone just starts with separate plates. In pre-America and the early United States, the practice was and remains one of taking your portion to start, and it largely remains so, even if that taking was largely done with one's hands. That's right, for most of the people living in the United States right now, there are likely at most 10 generations away from a mother who would have shown them how to eat with their hands. The single exception are people with East Asian ancestors. They have been using regualr, or chopsticks, since around the 3rd century BCE. The Chinese and the local food cultures they influenced have been eating with them for over 2,000 years. Hilariously, the oldest excavated table fork is also Chinese. A bone serving utensil from an early Bronze Chija culture site at the north end of the Yellow River has been dated to about 2000 BCE, or at least 4,000 years ago. So, how did we get from Proto-Chinese bone serving forks to the ubiquitous American eating implement? And while I'm at it, who is using their fork upside down? The Americans or the Continentals/Europeans? Which one's the weird one? Okay, so as with things like brooms and spoons and brushes, forks have been invented independently multiple times. I mean, after all, they do grow on trees. Forks have been agricultural tools for as long as there has been agricultural tools, and possibly longer. I mean, forked sticks are useful for foraging. Forks are helpful in moving about crops and cleaning out animal stalls, as well as feeding livestock. Think pitchforks. They probably migrated into the cooking arena first as things to move about burning logs and coals, and then moved up to cooking proper as handy tools for holding and moving about meat and plant matter when it was hot. Along with those oldest Chinese bone forks, they and forked antlers also appear in ancient Greek and Egyptian kitchens and lots of other places where cooking began to take on the trappings of an art. Incidentally, same for chopsticks. They were a cooking tool long before they were used for eating. Anyway, at the start, the whole world more or less used their hands to eat, and sometimes would use something that worked like a spoon. Spoons or spoon-like objects were made of durable materials like shell, bone, horn, and metal. They could also be made of biodegradable materials like wood and sturdy leaves, or the spoon function could also be fulfilled by an edible object: raised bread, flatbread, pounded yam, and even sticky balls of rice. The extension of the hand with a spoon has been done in many places, at many times, in many different ways. Once metallurgy moved along enough to make personal knives more usual, eating with a knife and hands also became common. Though things being what they are, knife possession continued to indicate a certain level of prosperity, so this style of eating was often limited to merchant and warrior/military classes, along with those in political power. The first recorded appearances of forks as a dining accoutrement show up somewhere in the 7th century within wealthy ruling families of Persia and Byzantine areas. The practice spread out through this region in the upper classes, so by the 10th century it was pretty common, if you were rich enough. In 1004, the dawn of the 11th century, a niece of the Byzantine Emperor Basil II traveled to Venice to marry a son of Pietro Orseolo, the current Doge of Venice. She caused a sensation by using a golden fork from the set she had brought with her as part of her personal baggage. Because the church in those days did the most writing, it's their disapproval of such strange behavior that was recorded and survives. Using more or less the same line as the clergy in the Massachusetts Bay Colony 600 years later, their translated objection was, "God in his wisdom has provided man with natural forks, his fingers. Therefore it is an insult to him to substitute artificial metal forks for them when eating." And in a similar vein as to now, the poor princess, when her death occurred 2 years later from a visitation of the bubonic plague, it was blamed upon her silly, vain food consumption antics. Clergy, gloating over that foreign woman's death, wrote, "Nor did she deign to touch her food with her fingers, but would command her eunuchs to cut it up into small pieces, which she would impale on certain golden instruments with 2 prongs, and thus carry it to her mouth. This woman's vanity was hateful to Almighty God, and so, unmistakably, did he take his revenge. For he raised over her the sword of his divine justice, so that her whole body did putrefy, and all her limbs began to wither." Some things apparently never change. As you might imagine, this gruesome incident put a damper on fork adoption on the western side of the Black Sea and the Dardanelles for quite a while. But sugar would change that. By the 14th century, sugar was common enough that Italians were making sweets of fruit preserved in thick sugar syrups, which were known at the time as suckets. And you may recall that suckets appear in both recipes and as ingredients in 17th century English cookbooks. Anyway, these sticky treats were mostly eaten by the very wealthy, and they were messy to pick up. And it would be a pity to ruin the imported silk of your robe by wiping your sticky fingers on it. And spoons tended to allow the sticky suckets to drop, again, right on the fancy vestments. Thus, the sucket fork was born. And once the fork was acceptable for sweet treats, versions of this 2-pronged implement worked its way into other parts of dining. Catherine de' Medici, in her 16th century wedding to King Henry II, introduced forks to France, and from there the status-conscious intermarried royalty of Europe started using forks, both 1- and 2-pronged, to hold all manner of foods while they were cut up. Now, at this point, it was common to eat food off the tip of a knife or pick up the cut bite with one's fingers if one was a bit more dainty. And then, of course, rinse said fingers in the dainty finger bowls. In any case, no one was putting a fork in their mouth. At that time, the sentiment was, ew, weird, who would put metal in their mouth? That's just odd. And that's how the finger bowls of this age made quite a bit of sense. And since tablecloths were rare, it was the sleeves of one's chemises or shirts and the neckerchiefs commonly worn that ended up being the finger wipers of choice. Anyway, at this point, forks seem to have been made of brass, which can appear golden, as well as silver and occasionally gold, and then forks of pewter and iron alloys were also in use. After a few hundred years, mainly using the fork as an implement to hold things still for cutting or eating things off it like a popsicle, this style of eating spread around and became pretty well known. In large cities that had active merchant classes, the fork started to be generally adopted over the next 200 years around Western Europe, becoming more and more common for anyone who had any pretensions above peasant. Incidentally, this was also during the time the bubonic plague continued to make regular sweeps through Europe, but no one was blaming the fork now that men were using it. And so, as fork usage became more common and was no longer so exclusive, the upper crustiest crust of the French clergy and royalty seems to have gotten a new idea into their heads. Eating one's meat off the tip of a knife came across as rather common and low. And then can you imagine? There was also the picking of your teeth at table with the same knife. Well, not to be born. People eating morsels of meat and other foods off the tips of their knives came to be seen as awfully uncouth. So, in the mid-17th century, for snobby reasons, table knives at the fanciest tables in France began to have ground down and then rounded tips. So the knife was still used to cut food with the blade, but the food itself was then picked up and brought to the mouth with the fork. And so, just as the fork had spread around Europe, this new round-tip table knife also spread. Thus, the European style of holding the fork in the left hand to hold the food, being cut with the knife, wielding right hand, and then bringing the cut food up to the mouth with the tines of the fork pointing down towards the plate, was born. Initially, picking up food with the original one-prong picks and two-prong forks was a bit of the pain. But royalty in the Prussian states, ever practical, began to add tines. So first there was a 3 and then a 4-tine fork, which made the fork more practical for carrying food to the mouth. And they also innovated more or less the modern curved shape. Initially, those two prongs had been straight, which allowed food to slip off or down into the fork. Creating that cupped shape with the 3 and then 4 tines made for a utensil that just worked much better for carrying food. And so it was after these innovations that forks started to truly become a popular instrument. Also look around. You'll notice that nearly all forks today have 4 tines. I hadn't thought about it until this either. But anyway, it was armed with the 4-tined curved fork that caused just about anyone who wanted to mix in even the edges of 18th century European polite society to learn how to use this new implement of polite dining. Meanwhile, back in pre-America, with the navigation acts and all, remember how the colonials had to ship all the unworked iron they were mining back to London, and they couldn't make nails or hoes or shovels or cauldrons or cannons? It also meant they couldn't make their own metal eating utensils. No metal spoons, no metal knives, so obviously no metal forks. An excellent place to see examples of this is at the Mercer Museum and Fonthill Castle Smithsonian Affiliate Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. Their exhibits are replete with cooking and eating utensils from this era. And there they are, almost entirely made from wood, bone, and shaped cow horn. That is the plastic, before there was plastic. At this point, metal was rare and expensive because, as you remember from the earliest episodes, every last scrap of it was imported or re-imported from England. So as you can imagine, in these Navigation Act times, sure, people would spring for a knife. Everyone needed at least one knife if they could get it. But who, except the most vain and ridiculous people, would spend money on a fork? This was an unnecessary implement they likely had no use for in the first place. But as people became a bit more prosperous, they began equipping their houses with these table knives, so all their guests didn't have to BYO their own eating equipment. Yes, bringing your own spoon and knife to eat at someone's house was actually quite a common thing in the 17th and 18th centuries. But with prosperity, people began to provide these items to visiting guests. But what they were receiving from England were these round-ended knives, no more stabbing cut food and picking it up with the tip of the knife. Word from abroad was that it was just too uncouth and disreputable to be eating meat slices off the tip of one's knife. So the bewildered colonists had yet another thing to be annoyed about. They had to hold the meat with the spoon in their less dexterous left hand and then cut the meat with the knife in the right hand. But because they couldn't stab the meat and pick it up with these nonsense new round-tip knives, and they couldn't stab the meat to pick it up with a spoon, well, thus was born the American switcheroo way of eating. The knife would be moved to the left hand as a pusher to push the cut meat onto the spoon, which was now in the right hand, and you'd pick it up in the right hand and eat it that way. It's true that only the most ostentatious royalist governors and a few merchants and plantation holders would have had forks early on, but because they were so England-focused, they likely would have been eating the way that fancy people back home were eating. So the fork and no fork divide can be seen a bit in the divide in recorded recipes between the more breakaway-minded northern colonies versus the more royalist-facing colonies to the south. Though, honestly, the divide was more along economic lines. The cookery of the upper echelons of society, especially in South Carolina and Virginia, which had closer ties to the planter economies of the Caribbean, saw themselves as always keeping up with back home in England and France. As a result, they were adopting the new fork fashions first. They were more likely to start cooking more of these separate dishes, vegetables alone, meat alone with sauces, following the trends developing, particularly in French cuisine. But as you went further north or down the economic ladder to the smallholders who weren't working cash crop plantations, they were forkless, and you can see that more of their food reflected a spoon culture. There are more stews and combined dishes. There's the baked beans, the chowders, the pies, the ollas, and the ragus. These dishes regularly combine a starch, cooked vegetables, and meat all in one dish or pot, with the ingredients already cut and ready to be spooned. But then there was the end of the navigation acts and outright rebellion, and now it was America. And we were making our own nails, our own cannon, and our own metal utensils, including knives. And to keep up with the Joneses, actually probably the Jeffersons, we were making iron forks. And then there was also that thing about all of the pirate plundered silver from the Spanish being made into silver plates and dishes and punch bowls and spoons. They were also making silver forks. See episode 50 on 18th century British colonial mercantilism for details. Starting with Benjamin Franklin and later Thomas Jefferson, there was definitely a stripe of Francophilia to go along with our hatred of all things British. So is the celebration of the celebrities of American liberation, along with the purchase of Louisiana and etc. Americans were interested in adopting the French habit of eating with the round-tipped knife and the fork. It's just that America was about 100 years behind Europe. We had figured out this way to work with a spoon and a knife and make it all work. So when the forks started to arrive in larger and larger portions of society, the Americans continued to use the fork the same way they had used the spoon. So it turns out Americans were doing it all wrong, or weird. So should we change? I have switched through my life, but I don't really hold an opinion one way or another. But you might consider trying the European way. You don't switch hands so much, so it means far fewer dropped forks. The general adoption of the fork can be seen in the archaeological digs of dwellings around the country. As you might expect, the wealthy had more forks early on, but just decades into the 19th century, they were widespread enough that forks are even to be found in the inventory of one Cato Howe at his death in 1824. Now, why this guy? Why is he worth noting in particular? This guy is worth noting in particular is that Cato Howe was a black man who was awarded the right to live as a free person with his wife in a tiny settlement with 4 other black families in between the towns of Plymouth and Plimpton in Massachusetts. This small gathering of 4 homes was known as either Parting Ways or New Guinea. Incidentally, the New Guinea designation was a common name given to all sorts of these settlements all throughout the new country of black families granted their freedom and a small plot of land to live upon. This one, also like many of those others, were granted to the men as a result of their service in the Revolutionary War. Now, while it's hard to know for certain, this ground was unlikely to have been, even back then, prime agricultural land. Like many other such settlements, it was located further from running water and seems to have been particularly gravelly, poor soil, not a location for farming success. In fact, upon Cato Howe's death, as he was the last of the men remaining on this land, the town reclaimed it to resell it. However, between the reclaiming of the land in 1824 through 1975, when the archaeological investigation that found these forks began, there had been no offers on the land since it was such a poor prospect. But it is very revealing that even in his poor situation, sometimes supported by the town, sometimes by a soldier's pension, or by the state, even Cato Howe had forks along with table knives and spoons in his estate inventory. As people moved across the Appalachians, across the plains, and out to the California goldfields, the silver mines of Nevada, the copper diggings in New Mexico, and out to the cattle ranches in Texas and Oklahoma, as they went to bring civilization in the form of fences, chimneys, and railways, they also brought forks with them. Spoons abounded and were more common, and they could be found made out of wood and horn and some out of silver, So even as the fork began its spread in early 19th century America, all the metal cutlery and flatware was still pricey. And this was because each separate piece was still handmade, one at a time. Silverware, forks, and spoons and knives were easier to shape since silver and its alloys melt at lower temperatures and are easier to bend into shape, which also makes them easier to bend out of shape. Silver, pure or in alloy form, tarnishes. That is, a dark oxide forms on the surface of the silver, making it look like it's gotten all sooty. So it requires maintenance, specifically polishing, a practice that practically demands servants or the efforts of children before fancy meals. You raise your hand if you're old enough to have polished the silver before a Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner. And when did your mother get over that? Iron forks and knives and spoons were also a pain. They, like their silver compatriots, also had to be cared for to prevent rust. The higher carbon steel in development at this point would rust less than plain iron, but it was not up to the miraculous capabilities of our modern stainless steel cutlery of today. Regardless of the material used, because these were all handmade, most early American forks were still two-pronged. The four-tine version had largely not crossed over. An occasional three-pronged fork is found in early American relics, but where we are right now in the early 19th century, the American fork largely retains its split spoon conformation. The earliest metal utensils were forged and pounded from metal rods, much like the earliest nails. However, with improved technology and the immigration of metal workers from Europe looking to broaden their prospects, meant that soon sand and clay molding practices arrived. These were used to form the basic shape for metal spoons and forks, with stamping, shaping, and polishing applied to the blank to bring it to its final useful appearance. But even with that innovation, all eating utensils were still individually handmade, which kept them precious and few. So the baby spoon gift makes a lot more sense from that perspective. Getting a single fork from someone as a wedding present doesn't seem so stingy back then. Inheriting utensils wouldn't have been odd, rather it would have been seen as thrifty and sensible. Even now, would you turn down a handmade spoon or fork, especially if it was engraved with reminders of your history? It wouldn't be until the 1840s in Prussia when a stamping process onto rolled metal would the formation of metal utensils be automated in any way. Yes, and after learning that the meat grinder also originated in this area, it does let you know that Prussia was the center of industrial innovation in the early 19th century. But even just getting it started in Europe meant that cheaper forks for more people would arrive in America, followed by factories to manufacture them. But that wouldn't happen until the second half of the century. But when it does, the fact of everyone having a fork meant that people at the top of the social standings would have to come up with more forks and more rules and more spoons and knives, and before you know it, suddenly there will be the whatchamacallit spoon used only for certain festive jellies. That's right. Here we are in the 21st century. And in the 250 years of America, we have basically gone from no forks to so many forks it's ludicrous, to back to like one or two forks, to now where we have Taco Tuesday and, once again, no forks. What a life cycle. Well, hands or forks? Definitely hands. In the early 19th century, it's time to talk about chicken. At this time, chicken is something of a luxury meat and the source of those seasonal, precious eggs. Yeah, it feels right to talk about how and why chicken was precious at the start of the 19th century and what it represented, how it was used, and why some tips from then can make you think more about leaning towards the using the whole chicken thing, even in our modern times. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know that you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews, and one of these days I'll figure out how to see those foreign ones. But the best thing of all, tell your friends, or even that person you just met, that you couldn't help telling about the connection between coffee and the age of exploration. After all, word of mouth does the most. And I still love to hear your thoughts. I'm getting requests to do interviews with more people. Now, some are way off the mark, but a few are interesting and very food focused. So if you could let me know on social media or email if you would be interested in me adding in some more interviews like the one I did with Nicola Twilley and the history of refrigeration, well, I'll start adding those in. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, Blue Sky, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.